Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. This is your instructor, David Leitner, and today we're going to address the peopling of the Americas and of the Pacific. All right, so we covered most of the peopling of Eurasia and Australia last time. The peopling of North and South America and of the Pacific are much later events. They don't start until the end of the last thermal minimum. So when the last ice age began to warm up again. That's when we start seeing these migrations. And as we'll see, in both cases, they were not easy things, and they were probably more complicated than we first thought that they were. To start with, we'll talk about the Americas. Now, the peopling of the Americas was enabled by the presence of a land bridge. Remember, during colder times, water is trapped at the poles. And the more water that gets trapped at the poles, the lower the sea level becomes. So at this time, there was, as you can see by the beige here, there was bare land that you could cross to get across what we call Beringia. That's what we call the land there. It is so far north, however, that at least on the American side, at the very end of it, it would oftentimes be blocked off, especially at the coldest periods, by the continental ice sheet and several smaller massive glaciers. Massive. The last time that was available was between 24,000 and 15,000 years ago. And we believe during this time, whether there was, there began to be a sort of ice-free corridor and people began to settle in this area, whether they were following their herds, whether it was caribou or reindeer, whatever, they had some reason to cross at this time, probably prompted by the climate change. Now, by about 15,000 years ago, the blockages in the ice had opened up, and it was possible for them to spread out throughout North America and very quickly into South America over just a couple thousand years, it looks like. And the earliest sort of evidence we have of these populations is called the Clovis Culture. It's called Clovis after the name of the site where their most characteristic material culture was first found. That's these Clovis arrowheads. They are very long and very thin. They involve a very specialized technique, and this is characteristic of the Clovis culture. We don't really see it again in North America after this, and we definitely don't see it before in North America. There are some similar but still quite different rock points like this in the Solutrean culture in Europe, and some have even gone so far as to suggest that maybe there was some sort of contact between parts of Europe and North America at this point in time, though that hasn't been backed by archaeological research. And honestly, it doesn't seem very likely at this point. But, everything depends on evidence. So, this group is descended from populations that lived in sort of northern Asia, Siberia at the time. The same populations that are related to modern Asian populations. But they might not have been the first people in the New World. We know that now that there was the possibility that people could actually travel, instead of traveling across land, travel across the coast, which you would be able to do even when the land route was blocked, because there would be a thin strip of livable land at the coast where it would be slightly warmer. And we now know from paleontological evidence that the resources, both animal and plant resources that humans need to thrive on, were available. The fish stocks and the aquatic, and as well as land plants and animals, were plentiful at this point. So it's very possible that instead of crossing land, this other group crossed before using a coastal route, hopping from one place to another over the years and making their way down until they get to the point where they can move inland, in the sort of lower 48 region of North America. These pre-Clovis sites, there are very few, but quite significant sites. The most famous and controversial of these pre-Clovis civilizations that came in by sort of hopping along the coast was initially known as Kennewick Man, is today better known as the Ancient One. That's the name that the tribes that claim kinship to this individual wish him to be called by. Initially, this is controversial for a number of reasons. Initially, the controversy was the fact that the anthropologists studying the remains identified the remains as Caucasoid, which the press misinterpreted as saying they were white Europeans. That's not what Caucasoid meant in biology. It actually includes groups like people from South Asia, Polynesians, that sort of thing. It's also not the most useful definition or way of categorizing human beings necessarily, but it gives you a rather general swath of the world that you can look to for relatedness. But as a result, many of the assumptions made by the initial reconstruction experts, when they did the first facial reconstruction, made it look an awful lot like Patrick Stewart. And that's because they were using assumptions about fatty tissues and skin depth that were derived from European populations, or largely European populations. So they were heavily biased in one direction. This is a more recent reconstruction. It doesn't look at anything like Patrick Stewart. It looks, if anything, far more like Polynesian people. And in fact, actually, we have some genetic evidence as well that modern Polynesian groups share a most recent common ancestor with Kennewick, the Ancient One, and that modern Polynesian groups are the ones he's most closely related to. Ownership is disputed for a number of reasons. First of all, the first scientists to work with the remains in the Smithsonian kind of didn't want to sort of give much access to the Native American groups who claimed kinship with it and had sort of legitimate claims to having inhabited the land that the remains were found on historically. Now, by and large, those disputes have settled down, and the real dispute is really about whether scientists are justified in trying to hold on to specimens they feel are scientifically important, and the Ancient One is, because we don't have many human remains from this time period. Is that justification for preventing people from honoring their cultural practices and their cosmology, that says that by digging up the Ancient One, we interrupted his journey after death? and he cannot rest again until we've returned him to the earth. So they want to rebury him. So these are all very important issues, not just for this case, but to ask ourselves in general about the ethics of doing work with human remains. That's the thing about physical anthropology, as I've said in the last video. Our object of study is not an object. These are or were human beings with families, with histories, with descendants. We need to take this into account. We need to be reminded that that's what we're working with, and that things are a little different because of that. And we need to think about these through the lens of ethics as well. Now, one of the groups that the Ancient One may be most closely related to are the Ainu, who are the indigenous people of Japan. If you didn't know, the modern Japanese population is not the original population of the Japanese islands. They are actually descended from Korean settlers to the islands. The original people of the islands are the Ainu, who are still alive, though they have faced cultural and physical threat from the dominant culture for a long time, because it's a situation of colonialism, just different from the way we usually think about it. But the Ainu are probably the most closely related group. And one of the important things about knowing that the Ainu have been on the Japanese islands for thousands of years is that it lends credence to the fact that that this connection to Polynesian groups and the Ainu certainly have a lot of connection with Polynesian groups, is very tight. The most important thing, though, is we've done genetic testing, not just with the Ancient One, but with other pre-Clovis remains as well. And all of it comes back saying that there's a significant genetic relationship between modern Native Americans and not only the pre-Clovis peoples, but also the Clovis people. Okay, and the ones post-Clovis. So that means that Native Americans legitimately claim kinship with both of these lineages, and that is extremely important too, because some racists want to use the presence of supposedly Caucasoid pre-Clovis people to disenfranchise and justify the genocide of Native Americans. So it's important that we get our facts straight when we talk about this, and that we honor Native American creation myths. Okay, finally I want to talk about Polynesia. The Polynesian expansion began about 3,500 years ago, and it started with populations in East and Southeast Asia. Possibly the original culture belongs to what's called the Lapita culture, named for the site where its distinctive pottery was first found on New Caledonia. And they date back to about 3,500 years. What is interesting about this is that from that point up until modern times, they had thriving ocean-going cultures. And by ocean-going, I mean traveling thousands of kilometers over open ocean with no land in sight to reach new destinations. And what made this possible was that they had and have an incredibly complex knowledge of both navigation and technology. The technology, they had sailing charts like this one right here that would tell them the most effective routes to use to take advantage of different currents, to get between different groups of islands, and so forth. Incredibly detailed, in fact. They also had a technology that Europeans wouldn't develop till the 20th century because they were inspired by Polynesians, and that is multi-hulled vessels. Multi-hulled vessels are crucial if you're going on the open ocean, because the only way to get a single hull vessel to be relatively stable is to make it enormous and weigh it down. But multi-hulled vessels don't tip easily in storms and in big waves. They will remain upright. And because the materials they're made of, mostly wood and fiber, they would float even if they did tip over. In fact, actually, to get through particularly bad gale force storms, sometimes they would deliberately take down the sail and flood the boat, because it wouldn't sink down beneath them, but it would become more stable in the waves. As a result, it would be less likely to flip. So yeah, that's pretty far ahead of Europeans. Their sails and their sailing technology was incredible as well. Knowledge, they understood how different shapes and forms of clouds could tell you the position and sometimes distance of land formations. They understood the position and the movements of the stars in such a way that they could use them to sail after dark. They could use a phenomenon that's not well documented even to this day, but called luminance, which, when you're about 160 or so kilometers offshore, you begin to see, as you're approaching an island and the land begins to rise up, there's a phenomena of these strange sort of flashing lights. They're not bright, and they're not caused by bioluminescent organisms. They are deeper in the water, and nobody really knows what they are. But the patterns of these lights and their nature changes with how close to the island you are. And so even after dark, you could tell sort of the presence of land, even if it wasn't on the horizon yet. Swell patterns. Waves get reflected if waves are going in one direction predominantly, they will be reflected in one direction and create an interference pattern in the other. Understanding these patterns of waves can tell you, again, without seeing land on the horizon, what direction the land is in. And finally, birds. Understanding the nature of the waterfowl of the ocean is crucial, especially understanding the birds who roost on land at night, but come out during the day to the ocean to feed. Because then in the mornings, they're always heading away from land, so you just go in the opposite direction. And in the evenings, they're always heading towards land, so you go in the same direction as they do. All very complex, scientific. I want to stress, this knowledge comes to them through a form of everyday science. Okay? Observing patterns in the environment and testing them. And this was a very advanced culture all along, and managed to take them from Indonesia and parts of Southeast Asia all the way to nearly reaching South America. And in fact, actually, there are some South American native stories that actually indicate that perhaps actually several hundred years ago there may have been some Polynesian visitors to the South American coast, the Chilean coast specifically, from Rapa Nui, which is Easter Island, which is a couple thousand miles off the coast. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and it is a different kind of migration than any of the ones we had before, because of this advanced knowledge and this advanced technology that they had. Okay, so that does it for our discussion of the peopling of the Americas and the Pacific. And again, I've raised some questions about the ethics of displaying or keeping or studying human remains that I hope you sort of bear in mind. I hope you take care of yourself this week, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.